good evening, students, teachers, and the generally curious, to another episode of the Constitution of American Life. As usual, we have Dave Richmond from Bakersfield, California, Chris Kavanaugh from Bismarck, North Dakota, Mike Williams from San Diego, California, and I'm Tim Moore, coming to you from Waukesha, Wisconsin. My neighborhood is fantastic. It's fantastic in many ways. We moved here in 2003 for a lot of reasons. There were sidewalks, houses with front porches. There were detached garages. The YMCA was a block away. Downtown was a mere 6-block stroll. A neighborhood park. We can see it from our porch. And by the way, it had the old school dangerous monkey bars. My boys loved that. There was a bike path at the end of our street. You know, it was a communitarian dream come true for me. You may be wondering, how in the world does architecture of homes and urban design influence this communitarian ethos? Well, I'm glad you asked. Years ago, in one of my forays into higher education, I spent some time in geographic studies. I recall reading a lot of literature on the post-World War II suburbanization process. Houses began being built with backyard patios replacing front porches. Sidewalks disappeared in neighborhoods. Attached garages replaced detached garages. Fences popped up, ringing property lines, and if you're in California, those fences are 8 feet tall. Many sociologists observed the net effect of all this was going to be a trend of isolation from neighbors. Connections certainly thinned out. The physical environment of neighborhoods negatively impacted the odds of ever having to interact with your neighbors. We conscientiously rejected all of that in 2003 when we moved here. And more recently, over the past 2 summers, in the evenings, I've noticed a wonderful thing occurring that's reinforced my preference for communitarian living. 5 young families have moved in with young kids in tow. Nearly every evening, neighbors gather at Joe and Olivia's front porch. Nothing is planned. We just show up. We banter about sport, Joe and I especially, because he's a Cubs fan. Occasionally, we munch on cookies or trail mix that somebody's brought to the party. Often a game of kickball develops in the street under the watchful eyes of adults who serve as sentinels for any car who dare to wander down Lake Street in the middle of such an endeavor. The sidewalks have served as runways for many a child's venture into learning the treacherous skill of riding a bike. From these impromptu gatherings, more formalized events have evolved in the past couple of years. We've had 2 tie-dye parties on our driveway, picnics to kick off the Lake Street fantasy football draft. A couple of musicians amongst us have gathered here in the basement for jam sessions. A casserole brigade has developed and been summoned into action when surgeries or tragedies have befallen our fellow neighbors. I'm not sure any of this would have occurred if there were no sidewalks, front porches, and detached garages. But even with the presence of those things, without people who possess the willingness to interact with others, the architecture and urban design only goes so far. Joe and Olivia, Paula and Justin, Mike and Christine, Glenn and Stephanie, Jake and Catherine are wonderful people. These young couples are demonstrate, at least to me, a simple but powerful notion that neighborhoods are more than just a place to reside. They are a place to be and to share with each other. So my advice, seek out sidewalks, front porches, detached garages, and parks. But bear in mind, there's still the need for the human component, my friends. That's on you.
Thank you there, Professor Moore, and welcome. Or I'm
Well,
sorry.
I've got the
Why do I
I've
do
got
this?
the
I'm sorry. This is why I should be taken out to the right field and be shot in the head because I tend to do this to you. Sorry, Professor Moore. Keep going.
um which one of these is most important? That's the task tonight. In 1938, Orson Welles broadcast a radio broadcast, The War of the Worlds, a reenactment of, caused all kinds of havoc up and down the East Coast. In 1974, Muhammad Ali recaptured his heavyweight title in the infamous Rumble in the Jungle. I think he beat George Foreman to regain the title. And in 2001, after a 3.5 year hiatus from the NBA into baseball, Michael Jordan returned to the NBA. So, gentlemen, what say we? Professor Kavanaugh.
All right. Well, I really, in my older days, I've really come to admire Muhammad Ali and his stances on what was going on in his life, and the fact that he was stripped of his title and not allowed to defend it during the prime of his life and still was able to come back. And obviously, Jordan is a GOAT. So, all you youngsters and all you LeBron lovers, take a number. Michael's the GOAT. Um, but I gotta go. I gotta go with the War of the Worlds and Orson Welles, because it is just a fascinating reflection on society, and I think there's a story in it for us today, and probably appropriate for our program this evening when we start thinking about artificial intelligence and social media and the power that it has to convince people. So we have a story in our history of these guys enacting the Mars invasion, the Martian invasion, that freaks thousands of people out, and all because they're listening to this program on the radio. And now we don't listen to radios for programs like that too much anymore. Um, but you know what? We look at our phones and we check the threads on whatever we're checking out. We're certainly streaming stuff on our computers as we're right here. So I think there's a story for us, a moral to the story of Orson Welles and the Mars attacks. So I'm going with that.
Professor Richmond.
I'm with Professor Kavanaugh. One, because I was never a fan of boxing, and two, I think Michael Jordan represents what is wrong with America, and so I'm with Professor Kavanaugh.
Wow.
Okay.
Short and sweet.
All right.
Mike.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the Rumble in the Jungle just because I want to share with the students. I mean, this has to do with Ali, which who had his title stripped because he was standing up for what he believed in, and then past his prime, he takes this fight to go against the champ. He wins it back. It's a great, for me, redemption story for Ali. But it's also really interesting about where it takes place, right? It takes place in the country of Zaire. The leader at the time was this guy Mobutu, who had taken over in a coup in '65. And this is a great example of what we'd call today sports washing, right? Of where Don King promised each fighter 5 million each, and then Mobutu put up 10 million just to host the event. It was supposed to be in September. Both fighters were there getting ready. Foreman takes a shot to the eye, he's cut. And Mobutu does not allow either fighter or the film crew to leave Zaire. They have to stay there for an extra month and a half or 2 months for the fight to happen because he wants this thing to happen. He has staked his legitimacy and reputation in Zaire on this fight. So to me, there's just like all these other implications of this. The fight itself is cool, but just and Mobutu students was one of the United States' most crucial allies. I mean, he doesn't get into power unless the CIA helps him. Um, so there's just a lot wrapped up in this. And given that I study African politics, I'm going to go with Ali.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I kind of gotta go with Orson Welles in the whole hysteria thing. There's some fascinating books out there about hysteria throughout world history, and frankly, when you compare it, Wells broadcast to other historical moments in history, it seems like a Sunday school picnic. But for America, there was real problems on the East Coast with this broadcast. So, yeah. Well, thank you, David. Let's venture into, I guess, what's affectionately called the Fourth Amendment. Up to you.
Affectionately, that's right. So, hey, students and teachers, we welcome you to episode 17 of the summer fall edition of the Constitution of American Life, where we hope to provide you some insights and perspectives on the Fourth Amendment in the digital age. Just to make clear that we are real people. We are not AI generated, because if we were, we wouldn't design the program with 3 geriatrics and a baby-faced non-boomer. So since we last saw you, the east wing of the White House has been totally demolished as the current occupant focuses on how to personally profit by building the largest ballroom, 90,000 square feet, and offering ballroom dance lessons to his followers and anyone willing to pay a large sum of money. And by the way, Tim Moore would be an excellent teacher of ballroom dancing. I've seen him in action. Also, there is an APB put out on members of the House of Representatives, given that they have been missing in action since September 19th, when they held their last vote. If you have seen your member of Congress, please call 911. So let's begin our discussion today on the Fourth Amendment with our very own tech-savvy friend of Publius, representing Middle America and the child of Western Pennsylvania, Professor Tim Moore. So, Tim, if the Bill of Rights only applies to Congress, I'm channeling James Madison. All right, this is my Jimmy, and one of his arguments, okay, that he made about the Bill of Rights. If the Bill of Rights only applies to Congress, I'm somewhat befuddled and curious. By what authority would Congress have to violate search and seizure in the homes of American citizens, which in turn requires the Fourth Amendment, I guess? So help me make those connections there.
Well, I'll start out with a refrain that Chris has often shared with us over these years, that no right is absolute. And that every one of our rights in the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court has wrestled with about, well, what abouts? Time, place, manner, government interest, scrutiny levels. I mean, there's all kinds of gymnastic moves that the court has done to try to get around that no law problem. And so, I mean, the reality is there's all kinds of circumstances that play into all of these rights. And by the way, I guess I think Congress has. I mean, when you look at Section 70 something, 702 of the FISA Act, Foreign Intelligence Service Act, it allows for law enforcement to do warrantless searches. Now, originally it was warrantless searches for non-citizens abroad. Now, there's been kind of an evolution of that, and now there's all kinds of speculation that there's warrantless searches going on here domestically and on American citizens as well. So I guess my argument would be, it seems like Congress passed a law that allows for this, and they're not having to respect the plain text of the Constitution. Another interesting thing to me is this, I ran into this term, the third party loophole, where data can be purchased by law enforcement from third parties, like phone companies. And so it does seem to me that Congress has passed laws ignoring the provisions of the.
I guess my question is by what authority in the Constitution can they do so? Because again, remember, and you know this, Madison's whole argument
Sure.
is that we already have rights in the body of the Constitution that
Mhm.
protect us from the powers that Congress possesses. And so we don't need this thing called the Bill of Rights because Congress doesn't have the authority to pass those laws. So, but they do
Well,
they do
yeah.
present this thing called the Fourth Amendment, which I guess, since it only applies to Congress, I guess they are acknowledging in 1791 that Congress does have the authority to violate search and seizure of private citizens' lives. And I'm wondering, by what authority would they have that power under the
I
Constitution as presented?
I don't think they do. But my response is they have.
No, I
And
understand
there's
they
always
have.
this argument that exigent circumstances warrant. So I mean that's my point in my opening statement, that there's always this like if you have a plain text constitutional statement, well, like no law in the First Amendment, well, wait a minute, let's step back. There's got to be some circumstances that might warrant this ignoring of the Fourth Amendment,
But
and
in
I
the
think Congress
debate,
has. I mean, the war on terror gets invoked. I think '08 was when the most recent version of FISA Act was either created then or re-upped then. So I don't think they have authority, but my point is they've done it anyway.
well, again, this is a fascinating experience. Is that Professor Moore wants to get into modernism and stay in the 20th, 21st. I'm trying to understand the 18th century is you say they don't, then based upon, I mean, was there any debate about these amendments and about
Very
the
little
fourth?
in Congress. That first Congress is very little, and they're looking at the colonial and state constitutions, and the text of the National Bill of Rights follows very closely. I mean, it's interesting to me that the most articulated, fleshed out version of this search and seizure piece was in the Massachusetts Constitution, where they're the first state to particularize some of the details, like items to be searched, the location. So Massachusetts kind of leads the way in getting away from in the colonial era, all these wide open-ended search general warrants, as they were called. And by the way, the violation of general warrants was much more draconian in the colonies um, than they were back in England. So there is some discussion in Congress, but not much. But again, most of the and in the colonial world, most of the search and seizure cases were regarding trade and smuggling. It wasn't much criminal law scenarios that occurred within the early states in
Right, and
colonies.
I understand that, given the empire and the powers of
Yeah.
parliament and the monarchy under the English system, but the whole purpose of the revolution and everything is to rewrite that and to contain it. And my understanding, I mean, we have a written constitution, and so they didn't grant the national government this power.
Mhm.
That's where I guess I'm confused of why have a
Yeah.
Fourth Amendment if Congress doesn't have the now it doesn't have the power. You're absolutely right. In the interim 200 years, Congress has figured out some way to do it. But in
Well,
18th
yeah.
century,
I mean, it's a great question, David, but you know my view on Madison's motives in creating a Bill of Rights too.
it's
Uh,
yes.
it's in my estimation, there's a lot more politics in creating the Bill of Rights, and so I think to ignore anything related to that, the '60s and Otis and open-ended search warrants, I think to ignore that in the new national constitution would have been it might have been a dead letter if that had not been there. So my answer would be there's a political agenda in having it there, even though it may not uh, mean much.
That's very fair, but somebody had to present it. I don't think Madison came up with the idea. Somebody had to present it. And I'm just wondering who was the person or the group or the committee that presented this to Madison, who was writing these things, who
Well,
who
he's
somehow thought, oh my God, the Congress could do this.
Yeah, well, he's taking suggestions from the state ratifying conventions. And I think 5 of the states, of the 9 that submitted recommendations, 5 mentioned explicitly and the what became known as the Fourth Amendment.
Chris?
Well, it's something to consider too is, I mean, I would agree with Tim on the political nature of Madison's authorship and taking into account, the state, what states put in their constitution simply in response to the general warrants or the writs of assistance. And, we mentioned that in this program before, and that is a huge, those general warrants have a huge influence on switching the mindset of the colonists, right? Because they're arguing about English, their rights as Englishmen. And that goes all the way back to Sir Edward Coke and the idea of, the Seaman's case. And I'll put a link in the notes about this case about where the king's men can go. And so there's a violation of their rights as Englishmen there. But then fast forward to Barron v. Baltimore, where Chief Justice John Marshall says the Bill of Rights only protects you from the national government. Well, how much law enforcement was the national government doing
Right.
in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s? You really don't end up with the national government doing a lot of that kind of stuff until you get into the early 20th century with maybe the Palmer raids, Attorney General Palmer, and the Red Scare that existed in the 20s. So there's a long history of, the federal government not really having that police power going after criminals. So that really doesn't, it's not necessarily applicable at that point.
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess that's my question. I mean, that's my curiosity and frustration is why have this thing? And you and Tim have laid it out, is it really doesn't become an issue to the 20th century. And again, I'm glad you spelled out the political component here. And as Tim, you said, there's obviously some people out there who are worried about it because it's presented. But I just think in a more practical way, I just wonder if Congress really had that authority under the written document at the time. So Chris, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the Fourth Amendment in the world that we inhabit, I am curious, is it just the Fourth Amendment search and seizure clauses that are potentially challenged by the modern tech digital age, or are there other rights, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Eighth, that dealing with accused persons that are also subject to challenges by new technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the Fifth might have been even cited in the Olmsted case from where the quote comes from, right? I think the quote and the question I think comes from Olmsted v. U.S. Yeah, I think the Fifth is maybe even cited in there in that the wiretapping case, right? But yeah, you're absolutely right, David. It's not just the Fourth Amendment; it is the Fifth Amendment. The idea about because in the Fifth Amendment, you're protected from self-incrimination. And so if I'm having to give up my, boy, I've got a whole list of things. We don't have enough time for the idea of, compelled decryption or biometric unlocking of your device, or a thumbprint or a fingerprint versus your face versus a code, because the courts have had to weigh in on that. So there's a Fifth Amendment component about self-incrimination because you're supposed to be protected from you can't be made to testify against yourself according to the Fifth Amendment. But can the police compel you to open your phone? Right? Can they compel you to unlock your phone? And that's become an issue. There's also in the Sixth Amendment in terms of a fair trial and the idea to be able to confront your accusers. Because what happens when the government uses facial recognition software, and that facial recognition software is not 100%. And we already know, and that's not the science is the idea that it struggles with African-American faces. So there are multiple components, not just the Fourth Amendment, as we move to this much more modern technology. Of course, all technology in the day is modern, right? Olmsted, they're tapping a phone. So that was modern technology. We're moving forward. But yeah, there are definitely multiple components, and not just the Fourth Amendment. There are Fifth Amendment concerns in terms of a fair trial. There's Sixth Amendment fair trial, Fifth Amendment in terms of self-incrimination. So absolutely.
So Mike, Chris kind of touched on this. The assumption made in the question is that challenges to due process rights, specifically Fourth Amendment, but others, as Chris has articulated, and our justice system by technology is nothing new. All right. We've been fighting this battle for a while. Would you agree with that? And if so, can you kind of lay out for students how this battle has been going on for a long time?
Yeah, no, I would agree that it's nothing new. So what we're living through right now is just part of the through line of history. So, think back to the 19th century as we get new technologies like photography or telegraphs, early forensics, and courts are having to deal with newspapers and mugshots. Is that a pretrial sort of like prejudice? How they're going to deal with those technologies in the courtroom. Then we get to the 20th century, as I think Chris has already mentioned, we have wiretaps, we have forensic science that's being used, and the courts are struggling with like which sciences are they going to say are legitimate and which are not. So, for example, fingerprints are legitimate, polygraphs are not, and these are things that courts and judges have to kind of like wrestle with to determine. And we get to our present, like with you know database sensors, even expert testimony. Courts have to debate like who is an expert, when do we allow experts in. Now we're getting to 21st century with these large databases and with all this tracking. It's not just a one-time thing. The government could track me continuously on my phone, right, given that my phone is telling them where I'm going and who I'm meeting with and who I'm texting with. So this is something that is the same. Now some would argue that what we as a society, what courts are going to be dealing with now, is different because of the scale of the technological change and the scope, like how much it is encompassing. Some would argue that it's different than these other technologies we have dealt with in the past. I tend to think that some of the principles that we're going to have to deal with in terms of due process are going to be the same, right? And the courts are just going to have to apply those principles to the new technologies.
So, is there any guideline? I'm fascinated and appreciative that you mentioned this history and you talk about fingerprints well, general science, not just technology, but general science and the criminal justice. So, fingerprints are valid, although we both have read about the squishiness of the science of fingerprints, but
Yeah,
polygraphs are not. And what
yeah.
about DNA? I mean, is there any guideline of why the courts say this science is valid, this science is not?
I okay. I think Chris, please step in on this if because this is where I'm on thinner ground. There was in terms of like what science could is considered legitimate in a courtroom. There was something called the Fry standard from 1923, and it said that the science had to be, quote, generally accepted in the scientific community. That that that's stop laughing. I'm
Oh man.
that's not the
Oh
part.
man.
Then there was this case in, let me see, 1993. I think it's Daubert, where the court got rid of the Fry standard and said that judges could use a more flexible, multi-factored standard where they can ask, has the theory or technique been tested? Has there been peer review? What's the error rate? What are the standards? And basically, the Supreme Court told judges that they are now the gatekeepers um, to decide. So it's no longer generally accepted. It is going to be this, like, I guess, judge by judge determination of which then you could appeal.
Oh man.
Yeah. Does
Oh
that,
So
man.
judges, so
does
on
that
top of being historians, judges are now supposed to be biologists, chemists, and things as well. Man, I didn't know the requirements for judgeship were that complicated. I'm sorry, Mike, but that just makes
no,
me laugh.
It's not a question for judgeship. It's a question of prosecutors and defense attorneys because what
right.
forensic scientists can you bring in and how credible they are? And we already
Yeah,
know that.
but
So
don't the judges have to ascertain the legitimacy, validity?
only if there's an objection. So if the defense objects or if the prosecution
Yeah.
objects, but there a lot of these forensic experts have been given so much leeway because again they're way over the judge's head. They don't understand this, so um, yeah, it becomes a roll of dice, and this is how you end up getting these expert witnesses that testify in multiple trials around the country because they've somehow established their bona fides
Right.
as forensic experts in say in the field of DNA or in biometrics, facial recognition software. So, once they've established their bona fides, and then if you have enough money, you can bring these people in, and a lot of times they'll get paid for their testimony.
I am curious, is there been a case where a DNA match was found to be errant? I got to look that up to find out if they
Well,
had.
I think what you'll see, and I think this is kind of important. What you see more so with DNA is that when overzealous, say, prosecutors or police departments have used evidence that may be flimsy to get convictions, we've seen DNA actually, exonerate way more people because
Yeah.
the science is newer than it was, say, 50, 60 years ago.
So Mike, while you were talking, this question came up, and I'm just curious what you think. Has has digital technology eliminated the right to privacy? Is right to privacy dead as far as modern society is concerned? I mean, as you said, they can trace me on my phone. They can access information on my phone without my approval. So is privacy dead in the digital age?
Um, I th I think it's it look, okay. I know a little something about this because I just had a guest lecture come in my class and talk about this. We have no federal guidelines on data and privacy. Congress has not passed a bill. So depending on the state you're in, like those of us, Dave, you and I living in California, we have a lot of rights to our digital footprint. Now, this guest lecture was pointing out to my students when it says accept cookies or read the privacy policy, you have to actually then use your will and like go in there and do it. Because if you say accept, then you're giving it all away, right? But in California,
Damn.
we have a lot of rights, um, and but other states do not. So it's state by state, right? So I think it kind of depends, and then it's going to be a larger question of then when it gets to the courts of how we balance these. Is there an expect? If I turn my GPS and I tell an app they can always track me, have I given up my expectation of privacy? Or when I say it can only track me when I'm using the app, is that the expectation? So does that mean the government can, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
is that going to be important? And the water level is quickly rising where I'm getting in over my head on this. So that's about all I can share on that.
You did an outstanding job
Thanks.
dog paddling. You're a great dog paddler there, Professor Williams. Thank God for your guest in the classroom. That's
Well, what's funny in a cultural sense is like when's the last time anybody's actually read terms of the terms that to get an app? So if I want to play Texas
the
Hold'em,
print's too small. I can't
well,
even.
exactly, and I just want to play Texas Hold'em on my phone, so just I'm going to go okay. So I'm happy giving my data over to these faceless corporations, but by God, do not let the government think about tracking me, which of course they can do then because so what Tim mentioned, the third party exceptions, because I've shared my data with somebody else. And so I've given up that expectation of privacy. It's like, yeah, I'm not sure that we actually have an expectation of privacy these days.
So I'll follow that up with that great question on privacy to Professor Moore. Over the years, the court has carved exception after exception to the Fourth Amendment. So I'm wondering, is the Fourth Amendment dead? If privacy, it sounds like it could be dead. Is the Fourth Amendment dead? Because the myriad of exceptions have just gutted it. What do you think?
Well, I'm not going to waffle around like my good friend Mike here. Yes.
I'll have some fries with my waffle, please.
This
Well,
question is not squishy.
okay.
There's no squishy here.
No, it's not a block of cheese. It's Swiss cheese if it's there, by the way. Um, I mean, I was surveying some stuff on how many exceptions are there. You've got emergency aid exception, hot pursuit, uh, destruction of evidence, plain view, inevitable discovery, open field. That's my favorite, open fields. And then the ever popular, well, if it's an abandoned property. So I mean, that's like eight of like 20 some. And then So my point is, okay, what's left? I'm sure there's stuff yet to be carved out. In fact, I think it's already started. It may have started with the TLO case when the decision was, it used this phrase that there are special needs, special circumstances. And since then, there's been, borders are special circumstances, airports, schools, workplace, um, code enforcement. You can go into a building and make sure that the codes are met, local building codes. And so drug testing in the workplace. So there's already more exceptions in administratively that seems to have been put in place in this category called special needs or special circumstances. So, I mean, I look at it and my conclusion is it's past Swiss cheese. It's probably really thin lace that the left of the Fourth Amendment.
Well, can I ask you, Chris? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say for students, the case that Tim mentioned is TLO versus New Jersey, and it establishes a different bar, if you will, for
Lower,
right, for schools, because in society we think of something called probable cause, right? Does the officer have probable cause, which there are like over 1,200 traffic violations they can pull you over for, so that's not going to be an issue. But in schools, that changes to something called reasonable suspicion, which is a lower bar for them going through your backpack or eventually making students pee in a cup, right, to do drug testing.
So, Chris, let's build on that, and we're gonna get into the digital stuff here real quick, and hopefully a little bit deeper. But given where we are here in about November of 2025, probably the most urgent and pressing question involving the Fourth Amendment is its application by ICE and Border Patrol. And I'm wondering, and I'll be honest, I'm really kind of lost and confused about this. To what extent, if any, does the Fourth Amendment apply to non-citizens, resident aliens? I mean, those who are here legally or undocumented. Help me out to understand where the Fourth Amendment worked with this group of people.
Well, traditionally, it does, the idea of being protected, right, is doesn't it depend on your citizenship. That's not that is usually not an issue, because the court has said, it says persons, right? So, and especially when you think about the 14th Amendment, because that's what we're really talking about here to a degree, is also the 14th Amendment. All persons are entitled to due process. All persons are entitled to equal protection of the laws. So we've got to make sure we're talking about the 14th as well as the 4th, especially going back to incorporation. Students, make sure you look up when these different things have been incorporated to the states as well. So the courts have traditionally said persons, which would protect you regardless, for the most part, on your status, your legal status of being in the country. But now we, with ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, and Border Patrol, and actually, let me back up for a second. Border Patrol, within 100 miles of the border, usually, I think this is the way the code is written, within 100 miles of the border, they can do stops without, like, a warrantless stop, which gets into a whole issue of Chicago, because Chicago is not, it's just more than 100 miles to the border, and they're claiming Lake Michigan, but that's the only Great Lake that we actually was within the parameters of the United States. So that doesn't really fly with that. So I would have mentioned that might be brought up in court at some point. So Border Patrol, within 100 miles of the border, I believe they can search folks regardless of legal status. But for the most part, the court has said no, it protects people regardless of their legal status, because they're persons. But as we're moving forward, we have a couple different types of warrants that they've been using. They've been using a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. The judicial warrant is a valid warrant. They've gone through the warrant process, right? They are looking for somebody, they go to the judge, they get what we think of as a traditional arrest warrant. And so that's regardless, and that's valid. The administrative warrant, though, is that people they've tried to use at times, does not necessarily allow them to search and doesn't allow them to seize. So make sure students, if you're talking about this, take a look at the differences between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant.
Is can I just add, is an administrative warrant? It seems to me an administrative warrant, the way reads to me like a general warrant.
So
The way it's being applied in the last 3-4 months.
oh well, the application. You know, we're talking about the law, but the application, my goodness.
Yeah, damn the law.
In terms of application, there's not even any cheese, right?
There's no lace, no cheese.
Oh, now I get it, Dan. Now that you said it that way, Chris, I get it. Yeah.
Tim, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I'm gonna be a little contrarian here and put on my textualist hat.
A little?
And I don't know if I believe this, but I'm largely doing this to maybe get a rise out of Chris. If I read the Fourth Amendment, it says the right of the people to be blah 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 blah.
Secure.
So I'm wondering if I mean you characterize it as saying persons. Well, I think that's a fair.
That's what the court has said.
Well, I'm being a textualist here, which is uncomfortable for me. But it says the right of the people to be. So I'm wondering whether anybody would make the argument that the people phrasing in the Fourth Amendment is sort of an analogy or an equivalent to the people, the people. So in other words, it's kind of a subset of persons. It has a meaning of people in the club, so to speak. We the people, in order to form our perfect union. The people. So I'm just wondering whether I guess I'm quibbling with your characterization of the Fourth Amendment being applied to persons rather than this thing called the people.
Let me. I feel like Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin here on Old Saturday Night Live.
Oh, ho.
But I won't go there.
Okay.
This is why I said you have to bring in the 14th Amendment, because for so often the people conducting these searches were states, and no state shall deny any person due process of law. No state shall deny any person equal protection of the laws. And this is what the court has used in so many of these cases to determine that this does not apply. However, there's always a however. You said there are always carve-outs. I would tell students to take a look at the case called Noam, our what is she? Our secretary. Noam, our secretary
Christie.
of Department of Homeland Security. Is that what she's?
Yeah, Barbie, whatever you want to call her.
Noam versus Vasquez Perdomo, and it was a case that came before the court on the emergency docket, or the shadow docket, as we've talked about before. And, because we talked about, can they stop people based upon, or is racial profiling constitutional? And for years, the court said, no, it's not. Police have used it and authorities have used racial profiling, but we've determined that, it's actually counterproductive. It's not constitutional. And yet in this case, ICE, Border Patrol, they are allowed to, and again, these have been called Kavanaugh stops from Justice Kavanaugh, who talked about this, that, well, they're brief encounters for these agents to determine whether or not you're here legally, so they can pull you over and to talk to you based upon the color of your skin, the language you're speaking, or where you may be working. And, and this is where Justice Kavanaugh totally mischaracterizes what's happening, because he says a brief encounter, no American citizens are being rounded up, which is not true. And I think Secretary Noam talked about that just today, I believe, that Americans are not being rounded, which is not true. So there are these exceptions now to be able to racially profile people by these authorities in their attempt to mass deportation, which flies in the face of previous rulings in racial profiling. But I'm sorry, Dave. Let me wrap up with Tim's point. So I understand what you're saying about the people. Now can you imagine our current court wrestling with the idea? Okay, when you say people under the Fourth Amendment, Does not include everybody a person?
Yeah. Well, I'm just at a minimum, I'm pointing out a textual dilemma. Now, if you go with the court interpretation, then it's a slam dunk on your side. I'm just pointing out the textual problem
Yeah,
with
that's why
how the original.
again, 14th Amendment, you've got to
Yeah,
include.
right.
Well, it seems to me, Chris, and this is just building off of what the question I asked Professor Moore, is it seems that the whole foundation of due process, all right, is founded in these fundamental principles of limited government, all right, presumption of innocence, and the burden is on government. And it seems like that's all been erased in the last 20, 30 years, kind of stuff. What do you think about that? That we've lost sight of these fundamental principles in our hysteria about crime and in our acceptance about technology kind of stuff. So I'm wondering what you think.
Well, I mean, I think Tim alluded to this in his opening question, that all the carve outs that we've had. And I would direct students to, what was that guy's name? Thomas Hobbes? Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
go back to Hobbes. And what do we fear? We fear the violent death of the hands of another. And when the people become afraid, they're willing to accept these carve outs because they think it's going to keep us safe. So we're willing to give the government more power to keep us safe. And so 9/11 happens, so we'll restructure the Patriot Act. Or if we'll worried about foreign terrorism, we'll restructure the FISA Act. And that, Timmy, you alluded to, that was a restructuring from the 1970s, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, right? So when we become afraid, we're willing to give the government more power. Previous program, we talked about the Espionage Act in World War One, where the government was able to crack down on people that we would think, oh my gosh, they're just exercising their constitutional rights. So we're going to get what we tolerate, I'm afraid, David. And
So, well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, no, I think that unless people or the government or somebody, in a legal sense, is able to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, rule of law, this is what this really means, due process. These are the steps the government must follow. So you have the right to know, and you have the right to be heard, and you have the right to present your case. I mean, there are all kinds of ideas about these old centuries old concepts, but we need people to uphold them. And if we don't, then they're like muscles. When you don't exercise them, they atrophy.
It just seems to me it doesn't resonate with the people. And I want to ask you, because you're in the classroom with young people, and Mike, maybe you can jump in. You still deal with young people, but just a little older than what Chris deals with. Do you talk to them about privacy? I mean, my last few years talking to kids about the intrusion upon their privacy, they look at me like, well, what are you talking about? What do I care? Kind of stuff. Now, that was my personal anecdotal kind of, is that your sense that kids don't worry about government intrusion on their privacy? Mike and Chris, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think, yeah, for a lot of kids, it's like, well, I've got nothing to hide. And I say, well, let me talk to you about my good friend, James Otis, right? Or, do you like the idea that the assistant principal can come pull you out of the classroom and make you pee in a cup and prove your innocence? We don't have a reasonable suspicion that you're using your number came up at random, and now we're just going to go make you surrender your precious bodily fluids to prove your innocence. And then they start to, so I think when they get it explained to them what we're really talking about, and I always like to talk about Matt v. Ohio and the idea that they're looking for her son in her underwear drawer. And they're saying, well, that's not right. And I said, well, exactly. This is why we have these protections, to protect us from an overzealous government. You may not have anything to hide, but do you want the police to come through your home anytime and look for anything that they want? Because that's a general warrant. So I think when we explain it to students, they have a better understanding.
Mike, you
Yeah,
deal with people a little bit older, but I just wonder if this ever comes across your classroom screen.
it really doesn't. And in fact, when I had the guest lecturer come in and talk about privacy, the students were kind of blown away that they didn't realize they had these rights in California. They didn't realize how easy it was to do to go into a certain app and to do this, and what it means to accept a cookie. right? They just hadn't thought about it. I think they're not critically thinking. I think Tim has said this numerous times the last few years that maybe one of the most enduring founding principles of the United States isn't liberty or equality, it's commerce. And that we're, as long as we have this device in our hand that brings us some satisfaction and we can do stuff with it, we're just not thinking about the implications. Although I do think that is unevenly distributed. I think that if there are students who have who are in positions where they feel a little more fearful about the government, then I think, yeah, they probably have. But at the University of San Diego, those students are definitely the minority, I would say.
And to back up to just to Mike talking about it, when I start bringing up cell phone and cell phone privacy, can the principal make you unlock your phone? Well, no. Well, wait a minute, you got nothing to hide, so what do you care? So when we start talking about the cell phone, that's where a lot of students, I want to say, live these days. That takes on a different tenor.
So, Mike, let's try to get to the core of this question. And as I was preparing, I couldn't help but think about Orwell, because in 1948, he kind of references the power of technology and the authoritarian or totalitarian state. And then I turned to the movie Minority Report. I love that movie, and it tends to point out both the possible benefits and dangers of technology. And then I recently came across the Council on Criminal Justice held a conference to address issues arising from the introduction of AI, artificial intelligence, into our justice system. Amongst the long list of concerns was, would AI strengthen or weaken issues of bias, fairness, accountability, and privacy in our criminal justice system, which we've kind of talked about? What's your assessment, as you know, given your background and your training, about the sense and the future of justice in a high-tech world?
Yeah, and I'm going to ask all of you to help me out on this because when I started digging into this, some of the stuff on this was just so technical that I was getting lost in the technical weeds of it. But here's my general takeaway. My general takeaway is that um, unless we as a society, through our legislature, right, put some constraints on AI and all these issues, that it's going to be just it's going to be kind of a crapshoot in terms of what different jurisdictions and different prosecutors and different judges and different states and different city councils are doing. And when there's not my reading of history for most cases with civil rights is when the national government is not providing some sort of line for everyone to follow. In most cases, it's not good for people's due process rights. So I am fearful that I'm fearful until we do something, and then I'm I don't even know how we keep up with this technology. I don't know even if Congress were to come back and uh, would you call for a 911 call if you see your congressperson? Like if we were to find them and get them back, if they were to pass a law tomorrow, it's probably going to be out of date, right? And then my other out of date in 5 years, and my other concern has to do with just the inequality of wealth that correlates, that tracks with inequality of power, right? We know that through our history. We know that in every society. And these AI folks they're the richest of the richest right now. I mean, they're the ones, and they are going to have a say on what any type of legislation looks like. And given that a lot of this has to do with, students, your data, my data, when we do this stuff, it's monetized. There are like we've been saying, there are people out there who are selling all
Wait,
of our.
wait. We're monetized? What
Yeah,
am
but
I
we're
missing
not.
something?
But it's just like this YouTube thing we're doing, Chris or Jim. We're not getting paid for it, but it's monetized. Someone's making some money off us. So
Uh,
yeah, I don't know who. I take that back. We'll edit
Yeah.
that. I edit that out. Where was I at? So I even have some fears that even if Congress
yeah.
were to get serious, what in the world are those regulation is going to look like, and who's it going to ultimately benefit, given this inequality of wealth, and who is right now calling the shots.
Well, and you question the ability of Congress to stay up with it, given the speed of which this stuff is happening.
Yeah,
Do you think courts can stay up with it?
I think they're going to struggle. I mean,
Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you, Chris.
No, I mean, oh my God, no, sorry.
so go ahead, Chris.
No, I mean, what we had a few years ago, justices are having to write something, an opinion about dealing with email, and none of them had ever sent an email. So no, they're not going to be able to keep up with it, even though you get some youngster people on there. I think that, back to your question that you asked, Mike, there's definitely some things that would due process that would scare the heck out of me. Do you guys know what black box algorithms are?
Not on the tip of my tongue, no, Chris. I don't
Okay,
even know what an
I know,
algorithm is.
I
So,
know Tim's all about them because he's all up on this stuff. This idea that law enforcement now are going to be using algorithms and AI for in the criminal justice system, like setting bail or predicting recidivism, right? And which can be incredibly opaque, right? And the fact that someone may be denied bail based on an algorithm. How about authenticity of evidence? We have deep fakes, right? How the idea of that. Resource disparity. Mike talked about money. We've always had a two-tier justice system anyway. I mean, let's face it, always. We don't execute wealthy people. We don't send wealthy people to prison, very rarely, because they can afford attorneys. But the idea of resource disparity is the high cost of digital forensics. People can't afford that, but people with money can. So as we move forward into this digital age, it's going to create a greater gap, I think, and I don't think any of our elected officials, and certainly not members of our court, are prepared to do that. I mean, think about it. We're talking about cell phones and searching cell phones with an amendment that was ratified in 1791 and hasn't been changed. The amendment process, or excuse me, the Fourth Amendment hasn't been changed since then. And we're using that to decide whether or not a phone is a person, house, a paper, or effect. So our laws have not kept pace with our technology. They never have, and technology is changing. Mike, you said 5 years. I would say 5 weeks because it just doesn't keep pace.
The question that the students are asking is, from Brandeis, and that, the Fourth Amendment has to adapt. It seems that you're saying there's just no chance for the Fourth Amendment to adapt to the speed of change of technology.
Well, we continue to use the Fourth Amendment, and Brandeis talks about this. I thought the quote is a great quote from the case about the secret in the closet kind of thing. But Dave, you asked a question. What about privacy? Well, it's good luck with that. So we're still asking our courts to use the Fourth Amendment to adapt it to artificial intelligence, where we don't know, and the people that have created the artificial intelligence, they don't know where it's going to end up. So where will we end up in terms of Fourth Amendment and the technology that's changing at a pace that is so rapid? I don't know.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. We've now come to the end of our hour together, so it's now time for you to share your final thoughts and recommendations on the future and what that's going to look like. So, Professor Moore, I know you love doing that. So, what's your recommendations?
I was Mike's segment where he went through like these technology cases where technology had to be the Fourth Amendment had to be adjusted to technology. There was one case Mike might have mentioned it. I might have missed it. Kylo, it was a heat sensing case. I thought that when I was way back in the day in the classroom, I thought that was an interesting case. Heat sensing technology, that's like ages now, but that's another one of those technology cases where they had to adapt the meaning of the fourth to a modern piece of technology. Another thing I think we missed, there was a thing called the silver platter doctrine a long time ago. It got me thinking. Your questions about applicability, David, to me. I mean, for the longest time, the federal government would use local law enforcement to illegally search and then give them, the federal government, the evidence. And I think that was called the silver platter doctrine, which I think there was a case, maybe it was Elkins that closed that loophole. So maybe students look into the silver platter doctrine and the Kylo case in your research as well, because I'm not sure we covered that. So,
Professor Kavanaugh.
Yeah, I forgot about the Kylo case. There for students. I mean, cops are driving up and down the street with this material that will detect a big heat signature. They're looking for people growing marijuana indoors. But it's interesting because if you look at that opinion, I think it's Scalia will go back to the general
yeah,
warrants
yeah,
because now that just allows the cops to drive up and down the street in essence to search without necessarily knocking on your door. Students, and this is a you're going to have so much case law in the Fourth Amendment. I think there may be more case law with the Fourth Amendment because of all the exceptions that Tim was alluding to. And I think there may be more case law in the Fourth than there is with the First anymore, which is amazing to me. But make sure you look at dissents. Look at dissents, right? Read those dissents. Know that kind of stuff. And you guys live in this digital world, and as Dave always likes to point out, we got three boomers and a not quite boomer on this panel. You guys live in the digital world. What kind of world do you want to see in the future for your children, and what power do you want to give the government to keep that world secure and safe, right? Because there's that line. There's always going to be that line between safety and security and your rights. Where do you want to draw this line in terms of giving the government power to get up in your business? And in terms of, I would also tell you to take a look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal from a few years ago. And you look at the weaponization of data and how that data has been used to manipulate the political process. So look up the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And I would take one more book that if I think about it, I'll list it in the resources. It's How to Stand Up to a Dictator by a journalist out of the Philippines. Her name is Maria Ressa. And she lived through this whole process in the Philippines a few years back of how Facebook was able to allow the weaponization of data by the government. So it really becomes almost David alluded to 1984 and Big Brother has become a problem with that. So those are some things you might want to look at in terms of your right to data. And do you own your data, or does someone else own your data? If someone else owns it, what can they do with that? Because that gives them a lot of power.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I'd agree with those comments and encourage the students to lean into their lived experience on this. You definitely have to know your case law, but I think this is an opportunity as you're doing your research on this and coming up with your arguments that you could really help people like the four of us to understand maybe where you see this going and what you see are the pitfalls. So as you're having these conversations, I would be thinking about that and thinking about there's a part of the question is like, how should lawmakers be adjusting the law to artificial intelligence? So I think you should be ready with coming up with some principles if and when lawmakers can get together, either at the state level or the federal level, or whatever, that you think through what those principles should look like.
Thank you, gentlemen. I do highly, just to add on, I do highly encourage students to watch as many dystopian movies as you can as you prep for this, and especially Minority Report. I really love that movie, and I think it gives us some insights into the possibility there. Next week, we're going to be taking a week off here before we come back to finish our season with our last two episodes. One of the FOPs is going to be traveling abroad into a foreign country, and we have a little bit of a bet going on whether they're going to be allowed back into the country by our federal government. So yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed there. So when we do come back, we're going to be first addressing a Unit 2 question, which allows us, and it allows you students, really allows you to question the sanctity and the divinity stupidity of our framers by thinking that they possibly created the Constitution that takes liberty away, which I fundamentally believe, and I know that Professor Moore does. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos. Bye bye. Bye bye.